And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a low pressure area moving rapidly up toward the upper Yukon Valley around 3 or 4 tomorrow morning, with a good trough extending southwestward. A lot of snow and blowing snow here right into the southwest interior, and to a lesser extent over the central interior, especially north of the Alaska Range, so you get up into the mountains farther to the north there. And blizzard warning western Arctic coast, Seward Peninsula coastal areas, Bristol Bay this evening for blizzard conditions. High wind warnings. Anchorage for tonight, gusts 75 miles an hour. High wind warning Alaska Range as that thing rolls through for gusts of 75 miles an hour. And a high wind warning for the Klondike Highway ahead of the front, but that'll be moving through rapidly. So rain and wind tonight for the Panhandle. And for tomorrow, that improves pretty nicely there, drying out with light winds, maybe some sunshine for the southern southeast coast, showery for the North Gulf Coast, windy Copper River Basin, diminishing winds south central Alaska. Another low brings more snow into Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula areas, extending northward, but we've got some higher pressure developing that moves eastward here on Monday ahead of this front, and that will dry it out with light winds over the western part of the state, although it'll be on the cold side, and cooler temperatures getting into southern Alaska with snow showers extending all the way up to the central and western Arctic coast. Another front brings more rain into the southeast coast as well as the North Gulf Coast. Winds for the south coast of the Panhandle tonight, or I'm sorry, for tomorrow, Sunday, west at 20 knots, central coast, west winds 25 knots, and west-southwest winds up to 30 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, southerlies 20 knots, south at 15 for Stevens Passage, and the southern areas here, southern inside channels, westerly winds at about 10 knots. And then for Monday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 15 knots, south 15 for both Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage. Southeast at 20 here for the central and south coast. East winds 20 knots for the north coast with seas around 10 to 11 feet. Prince William Sound tomorrow, small craft advisory. Southwest winds 25 knots, 6-foot seas. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast. Southwesterlies at 35 knots, seas 20 to 24 feet. And for the Barren Islands, southwest winds coming down to 30 knots, southwest 30 for Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings for Cook Inlet, southwest winds 40 knots with 9 to 11-foot seas. And those winds really drop off tomorrow night, and for Monday, looking at northerlies now, with colder air coming in, 10 to 20 knots. Good gales again for Kamishak Bay, or back into Kamishak Bay there for west winds of 40 knots, but northeast 35 for the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, all looking at an east wind at 20 knots for the day on Monday. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 30 knots, southwest 25 for Bristol Bay. Alaska Peninsula, southwest and northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And for Monday, Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots, about the same in Bristol Bay there. Small craft advisories northwest at 30, 7-foot seas. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, northwest winds 30 knots, a little lighter, but still small craft advisories for Adak and Atka, northwest at 25 there. And for the western Aleutians, west-southwest, 25 to 30 knots. Then for Monday, western Aleutians here, looking at south to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, south at 30 knots, Adak and Atka. Eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots with 6 to 10-foot seas. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for St. Lawrence Island, gale warnings, northwest winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for Norton Sound, northwest at 35 knots. Northwest 30 for the Pribilofs, north 25, St. Matthew Island. And for Monday, for the Pribilofs, southeast winds 25 knots. Southeast at 30 knots there for St. Matthew Island, and the southwest coast, northwest 20 to 30 knots. And brisk wind advisories for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound for northwest winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea Coast tomorrow, gale warnings, east winds 35 knots, northeast at 25 for the central coast, western Arctic coast north at 25, and the Chukchi Sea, north to northwest winds 40 to 50 knots. And then for Monday, For the Chukchi Sea, west-northwest winds coming down 25 to 30 knots, west 25 for the western Arctic coast, and for the central coast, northeast at about 20, and then west-southwest winds at 20 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline.